especially if we can have other decentralized public transport options that could help alleviate some of that stress from tourism into the local community. So that is also something I would be very interested in seeing. And, well, shoreline protection.
Yeah, good, thank you.
That brings me to one of my other questions is, looking at, potential opportunities, potential growth, looking at the future, how do you, and it looks like you've done a fair amount of work along these lines, how do I frame this? So we're a coastal city, right? We just got hit by a hurricane, in August. We had a near miss last year, and so one of the concerns going forward is resiliency, making sure that, that our plan takes that into account. I'm not sure that, when the city first was incorporated in the 1950s, those things were really there, that we've really given much thought to it. But going forward, that is something that, we have to be much more, just pay much more attention to. So how do you work with that? What is your approach? What do you look at?
Well, first we look at risk distribution and see where the greatest risk areas are. I have a feeling, I haven't looked at the risk maps, but I have a feeling that for St. Pete Beach, it's all going to be basically, it's all a high-risk scenario. Right. So then we look at vulnerability and then at where are our mitigation and adaptation strategies. So we can look at housing typologies. We can start looking there to see what types of housing are vulnerable to flooding and what we can do with those communities to inform and also to plan accordingly. That has to be a very, it's a complicated question because most people don't like to hear it's a high-risk flooding zone. You're always going to be exposed to flooding and you're always going to have to plan for a disaster that will one day happen. But bringing community awareness and empowering communities to take that into a way of life, that is the way, that is the city that we live in, but that does not mean that there are not things that we can take into account. Going into transportation, also evacuation routes, how do you make urban planning more resilient in case you have flood events? How do you get people to actually go to shelters? Where are those shelters located? And those sort of situations. Yeah, but it will always have risk exposure, and also look at the economics of what that means.
Thank you. Commissioner Grouse? Any?
No, I'm just listening.
Okay. I'm wondering if we have Commissioner Marone's questions. Or if,
I'm not sure
if Amber has them.
there are only 7 of them, so.
Okay.
Yes.
Can I ask, so just can you give us some examples of from other projects, what roadblocks or challenges you found and how you overcame them to get the project completed?
We sometimes have issues communicating with local stakeholders, and that is very much a language barrier. And there, the only solution that we have found is just keep putting in the effort to translate and identify what is getting lost in that communication. Because if our capacity building is not up to standard, then the whole project will sort of get stagnant for a bit. So yes, really putting in the work up front instead of later on is something that we have with community engagement and with capacity building is something that we have seen works a lot. Other issues that we come across is when our diagnosis is not aligned with the desired planning strategies. So that can be a very tricky conversation to manage. And what we do then is we just look at the numbers, and at the end of the day, it's just trying to be as objective as possible. We are currently doing a project in Maldives where we're looking at affordable housing opportunities. And there pretty much, there is land constraint issues, and the solution has been to just do infilling to create new islands. So we had a lot of pushback when we tried to push for alternative development patterns. So it was conversations that kept going back and forth, and at the end of the day, what really helped convince them was looking at the numbers, looking at how, yes, this is the way that the planning has typically gone. It's not necessarily the only way. We can look at the space. These are the areas where we could create affordable housing opportunities, and we could save so much money doing this. So, but it's not a conversation that happens overnight. It's something that's a series of meetings, and that we have to just listen and take it slow and just be patient. Sometimes that is another concern, that projects sometimes have specific timelines, but the time that it requires for you to develop that trust and that rapport with our partners, it takes a little bit longer. So just focusing on that.
Okay.
Okay.
If you need help in the Maldives, I'm sure I could be available.
Yeah,
Just saying.
I think any of us would be available.
Get online, I said it first.
No, those are very coveted missions in our organization.
Earlier on, you were talking about the process, and you needed local, I think you called them local champions or stakeholders from the community. Do you have, I mean, just to be, we're all friends here and talking open, I mean, as the mayor said earlier, we're 9,000 people. Sometimes we do surveys, we get input from 10, maybe it's 50. Would be nice and say 100, right? So we don't, so I'm just thinking in my mind, how do we overcome that? What type of, how many people would you envision we would need, and from a timing standpoint, and because, I mean, it's going to be a two-way street. You'll bring consultants and your team in, and then we'd have to staff a team, and you know, as you probably have seen from our city, we're very small. Our organization here totally, I think, Wayne, would be, what, 120 employees, roughly?
More or less.
More or less. So we're not a very deep organization. That includes Public Works and Recreation Department, so we're not very deep. So in my mind, I'm trying to think about how would we, if we decided to go forward with this with your firm, how do we staff that, and how do we get the engagement from on our side so that it can be, obviously it needs to be a successful project. Any views on that, or experience you've had from the local champions, and how many are you looking at? 10, 20, 30, 10 to 5?
Yes. Ideally, the more the better, but usually we are concerned with, we do a stakeholder mapping, we do a reach out, and then we see how many of those stakeholders we can get buy-in from and are open to participating with us. I think ideally we would look at 10 community champions, and what we also want to look in this for local champions is diversity. We need to have multiple of voices being represented. And so how do we reach them? And that's where we actually do need your help for that initial stakeholder engagement, which is going to be key. So what are very vocal organizations? And what are they concerned about? So that this can be business associations, neighborhood associations, school associations. Where do we get this? Like usually when you get feedback, where does that come from? We look at the community as a whole and see different types of populations and how we can incorporate that, different age groups, and then just have a very big wish list of these are our ideal local champions, and look at what we can get from there. But I'm thinking for this project 5 to 10. 10 would be ideal, but 5 can work.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, and just a quick note about the size for the organization. It's actually, we have found that tends to be an asset, Because yes, I'm sure you're all very, very busy and it's hard to get staff into this. But at the same time, it's easier to keep people informed and on the loop, and it's not such a bureaucratic process. It becomes more personal. So that we have seen that when we are working with smaller governments, usually we tend to get better community engagement.
Okay. And do you envision approximately how much time would be spent here on site by your team versus remote?
Well, that would very much depend on our community engagement strategy and our local champions and how they communicate. So we would estimate coming in bi-monthly basis, usually from our team, and just have complete virtual follow-up with local stakeholders. But we would really need to evaluate based on the timing of the project and also what our local champions look like and how they communicate. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have questions for us?
Yes. First, just time-wise, what are you looking at for this project? How long would you like it to be? Any particular areas of concern that you're already looking at besides the tourism development that you would like to see incorporated into a project?
I think timeline, I mean, we always knew it would probably be around a year or so,
Okay.
you know. As far as areas of concern, I mean, I'll speak for myself, and then the other commissioners can you know. So, I mean, areas of concern are, again, we're on an island, right? So, looking at, you know, we have a large population of residents, which is rather unusual for Florida. Normally, it's less people that live, you know, in the city. So we're very fortunate and unique in that way. And so it's, you know, it's always a challenge to balance the needs of the residents. And then also, you know, you have your visitors and your guests on the other hand. And so that's one of the challenges in looking at any, you know, revisions or changes that we make that need to take both of those things into account, which is also, again, our residents, and you have our business community as well. Resiliency in the long term, and we have several neighborhoods that, you know, experience flooding on an ongoing basis. You know, making sure that, you know, anything that is, you know, built in the future takes that into account. You know, we're kind of limited on land, so it's, you know, I'm not sure what the growth numbers look like or the potential for growth looks like, because again, we're on an island, and we're, you know, most of the vacant lots are built. There's very, very few of them left. So, I mean, those are some of the challenges that we're looking at. And
Was there anything in particular that triggered this revision? Why now?
Well, we've had a comprehensive plan.
Yes.
It's a state, I'm not sure, are you familiar with the state of Florida and their requirements for comprehensive planning services? So they started back in 1985, I think. There was a Growth Management Act, and cities had to have a comprehensive plan by 1989. So we complied like every other city complied. And it was put together, I think, rather quickly because we're a small community, not a lot of planners. We got help from the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council. And that was not really, I think there were a lot of questions in the community about how come things aren't happening. We hadn't had a new hotel built in 30 years.
Okay.
You know, we've got beautiful beaches, good transportation network. And so in about the year 2000 or so, we had the University of South Florida has a School of Architecture, and they did a kind of class project as to, you know, students they just kind of think freely, and it was actually pretty interesting to see the kind of things they came up with. And I think that got the community, everybody from the neighborhood groups to the Chamber of Commerce, to the commission, kind of saying, hey, we ought to really be taking a look at where do we want to be, 5, 10, 20 years in the future. And we had a solicitation kind of like this that was, I think, more about like a master plan, not necessarily a comprehensive plan, but looking at, how come we haven't had a hotel built? And why are condos popping all over the state of Florida? It was happening everywhere. At that time in the early 2000s, like 2000 up to 2006-ish or so, there was preponderance of condominiums, a lot less hotel development. And so that was kind of the basis behind it, was how can you take a look at our comprehensive plan and see why is that happening, and if we want to value tourism, how do we do that? And there were lots of public meetings. I want to say hundreds of public meetings, a lot of them in this room. And then from there, a lot of discussions about where do you go, because a lot of residents don't want any change, but some do want change. And so there's that kind of a struggle of how do you make hotels economically viable, at least on par with condominiums, if not give a little bit of a slight edge to hotels, but not overdevelop the community. And we're still kind of in that same situation, I think, today, is a concern about overdevelopment. How do you allow the economic viability of things to happen, whether it's hotels or condominiums, but not overdevelop? And I think we're still here today because, the issue doesn't go away. A lot of economics have changed, and I think that's probably why we're more here today, is because tourism is doing really good. The economy's been good. Tourism is doing great. It isn't always that way. We've had hurricanes, red tide, economic issues like in 2008, but now we've solidified our infrastructure. We just did major improvements to our sanitary sewer system, and it's in a way kind of like a perfect storm, I guess you could call it, where hotels are now looking to develop, and the questions are, to what extent do you allow them to develop without hurting the character of which is the reason why you moved here in the first place? Along with the things that the mayor mentioned about, resiliency. I mean, we're seeing neighborhoods that used to never flood are now flooding on a regular basis. I've had residents telling me, I haven't flooded in 35 years. It's something that the city has either done or not done. The water is coming up, and if you're in a low-lying area like the Don Cesar area, every inch counts. So even if the water level has only gone up this much in the last 30 years, that's enough to put salt water in your street, and everybody knows that's not a good thing for your car driving through that stuff. So I think this is just kind of a fresh look. Okay, can we take a look at where are we at? Economics have changed. Of course, construction costs have gone through the roof now, so that has an impact. But then again, hotel room rates are going up. So, I mean, and then land values are going up.
Yeah.
So, so you got all these things, nothing stays still. It's all moving. So how do you take all that stuff into account and plan for the future?
Because from what I'm hearing on that particular area of concern, is that it almost seems like that should be an individual project. Just very focused on this question is, we have tourism, it's an asset, but how can we conserve that asset without it overcoming the needs of the residents? And just have the whole project centered on that particular question. It will also help with conversations. It would help us keep in track with this particular issue, and that can inform a later comprehensive planning instrument. That's just a recommendation, because it is a very big question to ask, and it's a very interesting question to ask. But it's also a resource constraint issue. Is if you're looking at the whole, then you might miss very interesting things that happen with this. So if that is something you're interested in, we could review our proposal and see how we could just adjust it to this particular pain point. It will obviously incorporate other things. It will not just be about tourism. It will be about the role of tourism in transportation. What are the different scenarios for that? But it would very much be based on this particular question of tourists versus residents, instead of just a comprehensive city plan. I mean, I think that would be a very interesting project to have.
And you're right, there's a relationship between tourism and other things, and I think that was recognized when we saw other communities go towards a preponderance of condominiums. and you could see it on St. Pete Beach, maybe not all condominiums, but the ones that I'm kind of aware of, they're not their primary homes.
Yes.
It's their second or their third homes. So, I mean, shockingly to me, there are some people that only have a condo they own all year, and they only stay in it for like a month out of the year, or maybe 2 months out of the year. So they're not here to support all of the other businesses, whether it's the grocery store, the retail, the restaurants, the shops, and all that. So if you go up to places like Sand Key, as an example, up in Clearwater Beach, only 25 miles or so north of here, they got really tall condominiums.
That's all they have.
That's all they have. There's nothing around. It's like a dead zone, which is, and I'm assuming that those people that's not their primary home, preponderance of them. That's their second or third. So they're not supporting the economy. And you might say, well, why do I care? They're not here, so they're not packing up the roads and
But
doing
it's
all
land
that.
use, then
Well, but then we're losing all of
Yeah.
the other, support services that go along with it, whether it's restaurants, retail, all those things that you really enjoy to have here locally.
Changes the dynamic of the town.
Yeah.
You know, you go, like you say, to more of you're not a tourist-based town anymore.
Yeah.
It's just more of a residential. Everything is residential.
Without the advantages of it being residential, because there's not an actual active community there.
Right.
So that's an issue. And also, I don't know if you're interested in looking at affordable housing, but I mean, it's a lot of land that is just not occupied most of the year. So that is another thing that we could look at if we take a deep dive into how does this particular question influence other areas.
I think that's a question worth looking at, because I will disagree with the distinguished commissioner, mainly because of when you look at the population numbers that we have and the registered voters that we have, which requires that they live in the city for at least 6 months out of the year, it's 85–90%. So that to me tells me that the vast majority of homeowners do live here, even if it's 6 months and a day, they do live here. So that might actually be something worth investigating to help answer that question, is what is the actual real ratio? Because we're looking at probably the same data coming to the different conclusions. But that might actually be worth looking at and saying, what's the makeup actually look like? So that based on that makeup, then we can make different decisions and say, okay, well, look, if it is a high residency, high occupancy rate from primary homeowners, great. And if it's not, then maybe we need to look at
And I think maybe some of the single-family homes are more, occupied on a full-time basis. But there was something, we just went through that year report, and there was hundreds of pages of stuff. Part of that in there was some data on homestead exemption. And if I remember reading, it was 30-something% of the data in that year report. We could go back to that, the last commission meeting and get that information. So maybe it's different ways of looking at it, but
Is that it doesn't jive on who's here, and yes, it's a high number, but you need six months and a day to
Right,
get the homestead
exactly.
exemption.
right.
Yeah. But then why would you register to vote here and not have the homestead exemption? It just almost doesn't. So that's what I'm saying, we need to reconcile those numbers and figure out what the real number is, so that we can make decisions based on that.
And where it's located, because a number is one data point, but it's very different. You have them scattered around throughout the community, whereas if you have these pockets of gated communities that are not occupied. I mean, it's a very interesting question, so, yeah.
Yep.
And to answer your question earlier, we've been talking about this probably about a year now.
Mm-hmm.
Started last October, having these more in-depth discussions. And really, they really spurred from probably starting with the redevelopment of the Miramar Hotel, and then, which interestingly hasn't done anything in more than a year. There was another development, the East Quarry development, and those discussions started even harder. And then, of course, with the current proposals that are coming through later sometime this year for further development, there's been a lot of discussion in the community.
Yeah, I think so. We had was it 6-7 year moratorium in place? on any new development because of our, wastewater system. And so, out of sight, out of mind, you can't do anything, so no one's thinking about it. Yes, traffic is bad, especially on weekends, especially on holidays, during our season, which is, January through April, May or so. We all kind of knew that. And then once that moratorium was lifted, then the issue came to the forefront, right? Because now the moratorium is gone, and every developer is looking in Florida because it's a great place. We got great tax incentives. We got all sorts of amazing things here, and they're looking everywhere else. Well, Miami's pretty built out, East Coast pretty built out. What's left? Tampa Bay area as a whole. The 3 or 4 counties in this area. It's one of the fastest growing, not just in Florida, but in the country, whereas before it used to be more concentrated on the East Coast. Now it's moving to the middle and to the West Coast of Florida because we haven't had necessarily the same growth that the East Coast has seen. And so now you have an influx of individuals looking at our city, and our residents all of a sudden said, oh, hold on a second, I thought we couldn't build anything. And now we're looking at, okay, what's going to happen if all of these things start coming in? Is it going to be more traffic? Is it going to get worse? What's our quality of life going to look like? And so that's what precipitated the start of this discussion, once that moratorium was lifted, I think.
Yeah.
And the money came back in the market.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, the economy was robust.
Right.
Too.
Yes, so we're looking at different scenarios, but also different growth opportunities. So that's something that we would like to see is if population follows certain patterns, but tourism follows different levels of increase, and then how that would affect the city and the land use. Yeah, I think, well, my recommendation would be to just make a very concentrated project on this. It sounds really, really interesting. Yeah.
I mean, that might make sense, since that's really what precipitated the whole discussion.
That's what I was thinking, focusing it.
Yeah.
And we can also look at what, besides that question, are there any other particular indicators of the city that you're interested in looking at? Maybe it's energy consumption, energy security, and we can see how this particular question informs those decisions. But, yeah.
Well, I think this question is, this issue is then tied really to the greater issue of resiliency.
Mm-hmm.
Again, looking at being a small island and, the ramifications of where are we going to be in 10, 20, 30 years from now.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions from Commissioner Morone? Okay. Didn't know if he submitted any we could read out for him. All right.
Oh, good.
Thank you very
Is there
much.
anything else?
No.
Well, no. Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for this opportunity. Please do let us know if you're interested in just narrowing down this project. We're also very happy to take a look at the proposal and then tailor it to this.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Thank you.
Should we take a 6-minute adjournment? And,
Sounds,
We started
Or
4
the-
or 4:15?
4:15.
oh, 4:15? Oh, okay.
But adjournment.
So we will adjourn for 20 minutes till 4:15?
good.